and welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Dr. Leonard Horton, who will be presenting on traditional music of Japan. Dr. Leonard Horton has been with Temple University, Japan since 1990. He teaches courses in classical, world, and popular music, in addition to teaching and composing. Professor Horton is active as an editor and preparer of musical manuscripts of new music by American composers for performance and publication. And he is founder and director of the Temple University Japan Chorus. Dr. Horton, it is a pleasure to have you with us today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Amani. It's my pleasure to be here today. When I served as a presenter on one of these webinars a year or so ago, I spoke only about traditional Japanese music and some of the characteristics of it and some of the instruments used. I didn't want to do the same thing today, assuming that maybe some of the participants today might be some of the same, and I didn't want to do an exact repeat. So I decided to speak today a little bit about a form of Japanese popular music known as anka, which actually has a very long history, much longer than many people might be aware of. First of all, let me start by playing an example of anka for those of you that may not be familiar with it. If you happen to be in Japan, you turn on NHK on a Tuesday night, you can get several hours worth of anka. It's a very, very popular form of entertainment. So let me start by playing you a minute or minute and a half example by way of introduction. Make sure I'm sharing sound. Okay.
背伸びしてみる海峡今日も汽笛が遠ざかるあなたにあげた夜を返して函館通り雨流す涙では酒は騙した男の味がするあなたの影を引きずりながら港構いし平線
All right, just to give you sort of an introduction for those of you who have not heard anka before. That's pretty typical of what, as I say, what you would hear if you were to turn on NHK on an anka night. Certain things that you may have noticed right away. There were multiple singers, very often, more often than not, probably it's just a single singer, either male or female. You notice that the singers were supported in the background by a fairly large ensemble of instruments. What I'd like to do is I'd like to go back to early anka and show how it started, what anka sounded like in its early years and how it gradually changed to become what it is today. Because what it is today is not just simply a form of traditional Japanese music that's completely traditionally Japanese, but there are many Western influences in it that sort of crept into that particular form over the decades. I'm going to start by playing you a really early example of anka. Anka started actually in the 1880s, so it's nearly 150 years ago. I'm going to play you an early example, and then I'll talk about what you're hearing. The sound quality, by the way, is going to be fairly poor because this recording is from 1900, so it's almost 125 years old. But just listen for a moment.
欧米の川上一座が先代のおっぺで手を引き立ちます。ままにならぬは時代のならい。ままになるのは米ばかり。あ、おっぺでとぺとと。世紀極まる今日に大人今週会議水まぶかにかぶった高帽子。金の入り輪に金時計、専門試験に膝を曲げ、芸者太鼓に金を巻き、一には蔵に米を積み、ただしメイドのお土産か、地獄で閻魔に面会し、賄賂つこうて極楽へ、いかるかへ、いけないよ、おせれれ、おせれれ、とせとせ。
All right, you'll notice that that sounds notably or remarkably different from that first example that I was playing, and of course this is from more than 100 years ago. All right, first of all, let me bring up a handout here to talk about the beginnings of enka. Enka started back in the 1880s. And it happened during the Meiji era. The Meiji era began in 1868 and lasted until 1912. Now, keep in mind that before that era, Japan had been largely sort of cut off from the rest of the world. It had been isolated from the rest of the world, and there wasn't a lot of exchange back and forth, and what there was very carefully controlled. During the Meiji Restoration, Japan, this was a period in which Japan opened up to the rest of the world, and not only was having an influence in other parts of the world, but was absorbing influences, many of them from the West, and many of them were welcomed influences. For those of you that live or have lived in Japan, if you're walking around Tokyo, for example, and you see a building, for example, Tokyo Station, and it looks European, that's part of the European influence that was coming in during the Meiji era. That's the era during which some Japanese began to adopt Western fashion, style of dress, architecture, and of course music. Elements of Western music would begin to appear. In this example that I was just playing for you, this is an example of the Western influence in Japanese culture, but not really in music. So if I bring up this a handout here, what you were just hearing is an example of what's called soshi enka, or political enka. Enka, let me just read from this. Enka first appeared in the 1880s as a type of political song in support of the freedom and people's rights movement, which was a pro-democracy movement inspired by Western countries. One of in addition to cultural things like architecture and fashion and music that had an impact in Japan during the Meiji era, some people looked at Western countries and saw Western democracy and thought, well, hey, that's a pretty nice idea too. At the same time, though, that could be perceived as something of a threat to a centralized government, if you start giving the people all the power. But this was a pro-democracy movement. And in order to curb speech in support of this movement, there were restrictions put on speech which prohibited people from making pro-democracy or pro-movement speeches. So cleverly, of course, sort of something of a loophole, people began to sing songs about the pro-democracy movement, and that's what you were just listening to. I've got here on this handout, can we see the handout okay? Okay. You were just listening to this one right here, O Pekape, which was from 1887. That recording, as I say, was from 1900 by an entertainer named Otojiro Kawakami, who had traveled to the West and who had firsthand observed Western culture. The word O Pekape is a vocable. It has no meaning. It's kind of like fa la 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 in Deck the Halls. but the words that do have meaning are the significant ones. For those who dislike rights and happiness for the people, I'd like for them to drink the water of freedom. They've replaced their traditional clothes with Western capes and pants and use rickshaws, fancy hair and bonnets, done up like ladies and gentlemen. Their outward appearance may be fine, but their political thinking is lacking and they don't understand the truth of the land. We should plant the seeds of freedom in their heads. These clearly, this is it's political in nature. It's in support of, as I say, this freedom and people's rights movement. The song itself, when you listen to it musically, there is nothing Western about it to my ear. It is totally Japanese. What is Western about it is the text, what it's about, the subject matter. I'm going to go back for just a moment and play you a more recent recording of that song, just so you can hear it a little more clearly, so I can say a little bit about the musical characteristics of it. Same song.
権利幸福嫌いな人に自由とおば飲ましたい。おっぺけぺおっぺけぺおっぺけぺっぽぺっぽっぽは硬い紙紐角取れてアマンテルズボンに人力車粋な側発ボンネット貴女に紳士のいでたちで上辺の飾りはよけれども政治の思想が欠乏だ天地の真理がわからない心に自由の種をまけおっぺけぺおっぺけぺっぽぺっぽっぽ
All right, now musically, when you listen to this recording, obviously more recent, it's a much clearer, but it's the same song. Obviously, the language is Japanese. As I say, the text is the only thing that's really Western about it. You heard a musical instrument, and that musical instrument is the shamisen. Just in case any of you are not familiar with the shamisen, it's the three-stringed lute-like instrument that looks like this. It's one of the traditional instruments of Japan. And I'm going to say a couple of things about some traditional characteristics of Japanese music. Traditional Japanese music typically uses 5-note scales. In the West, we tend to use 7-note scales, like the major scale or the minor scale. In traditional Japanese music, the traditional scales typically have 5 notes. They're referred to as pentatonic scales, and this is part of what the reason that Japanese music sounds Japanesey. There are a number of different scales. One of them is this one. You notice right away it has a Japanese sound to it. Here's another one. Or if you're in Okinawa, but each one of those is a 5-note scale. The early enka songs that you were listening to, not that they have that much of a melody, but what they do tends to be pentatonic in nature. And the accompanying instrument, the shamisen, is pretty much playing the same thing that the vocalist is singing. It's maybe slightly ornamented in a different way. But they are basically doing the same thing. One thing about traditional Japanese music is you don't have harmony in the way that we think of harmony in the West. You know, when you're thinking about Western music, you think you hear a melody and you expect chords. And that's not an element of traditional Japanese music. Instead, we have the shamisen in the voice going on in pretty much the same melodic line. All right, let's go forward into the early 1900s. And I'm going to play you an example of from 1918. This also is enka, but a different different example. Just listen to the sound of it first. All right, I'm going to play just a moment more of that, but let me sort of direct your ears to something. You'll notice you still have the Japanese language. You have the sound of one instrument accompanying the voice. Only one big difference here is that the instrument is not a traditional Japanese instrument, the shamisen. It is, in fact, a violin, which, of course, is a Western instrument. So we're beginning to see here in the early 1900s a little bit more influence from the West. It's not just the idea of democracy that we saw in the other one. Now we're actually hearing musical influences. Once again, at the same time, you still hear the violin essentially playing the same melody that the voice is singing. Note the two, they're singing playing pretty much the same melodic line. All right, now what about the words here? The words are beginning to change. This is an example of what is referred to as violin enka, because it was accompanied by a violin. The language, of course, is still Japanese. This is from 1918, and you've got the Japanese here on the left, and on the right you can see an English translation. If you look at the words here, you'll notice there's not really anything political about them. By this time, the freedom and people's rights movement was a thing of the past. You know, there was a constitution, some things had been given, but Japan had not really become the democracy that many people had hoped for. You'll see here that the lyrics, in a way, are kind of comical. There were some serious lyrics to this song down here. These are a little bit more political in nature, but notably they have been omitted from this 1918 recording of the song, as they would, I assume, would not have been very popular at the time. So enka, we can see the connection with the earlier enka, but the instrument has changed. It's the Western violin instead of the traditional shamisen. The language is still Japanese. It's still a pentatonic melody. That one is using that scale, that 5-note scale right there. There's more singing than speech-like a presentation of the lyrics here. But we see a similarity with what we heard before, but something very different at the same time. All right, let me go forward once again, maybe another 15 years and play another example for you. This is an example of a piece of music called Moonlight Beach, or Tsuki no Hamabe. This is from 1931. This example, I assume that probably all of you are able to hear. We still have a vocalist singing in Japanese. We still have instrumental accompaniment, but there's one thing really notably different about this instrument. It is still a Western instrument, just as the violin before it had been. This time, though, it's a guitar. The significant difference between the violin and the guitar is that the violin is a monophonic instrument. It typically plays one note at a time, and in the example we heard previously, it's the same notes that the voice is singing. The guitar is different because it is a polyphonic instrument. It is capable of playing multiple notes at the same time, which means not only can we now have a melody, basically a pentatonic melody being sung by the voice, but we have chords being played by the guitar. So not only do we have a Western instrument here, but we have the Western concept of chordal harmony in support of the melody. So little by little, we see more and more Western influence creeping in here. Now, the words, for those of you, some of you may have been able to understand the words, but for those of you that weren't, this is a song in which we have a woman singing about being separated from a lover. She's on the beach at night, listening to the sound of the waves and the moonlight and all of that. But more than anything, it's about parted lovers or a lost romance. This is going to be a theme that's going to come back again and again up until the present time. The early Enka started with political text, and they sort of gradually lost that and evolved into more romantic, but especially sorrowfully romantic songs. By this time, by the way, the term Enka itself began to fall into disuse. The songs sort of came under the overall umbrella of popular song, or what was called ryukoka. And people stopped using the term Enka. The term Enka had been a reference to speech song, which is what Enka had started as. So we're not even referring to it as Enka anymore, but we're still seeing the song's style continue to evolve. All right, by the 1950s, if you think about what happened between the example you were just hearing, 1931, and the 1950s, what happened? Well, of course, World War II happened. And at the end of the war, of course, that was followed by occupation by the Allies. The American army were here our military were in Japan in large numbers. And of course, that means that there's going to be mainstream American popular music in Japan being listened to and enjoyed by American military personnel. And of course, that's going to spill out into the general population. Now, the popular form of music in American World War II, the most popular, was a big band jazz, which meant you had ensembles of large ensembles of instruments like trumpets and trombones and clarinets, etc. In a way, this is one of the important next ingredients in the evolution of Enka as we begin to see the transition from shamisen to the Western violin to the Western guitar playing a harmonic or chordal accompaniment, and then to an accompaniment by a large ensemble of instruments. And I'm guessing you're probably already making that connection with what you saw in the very first example that I showed you, where you had a large ensemble in the background. There were some jazz elements, but more than anything, just the sound of the larger ensemble became an important ingredient by the 1950s. I'm going to play another example. This is when we get to the 1950s, you began to see gradually the reemergence of the term Enka to be used to this movement, to be used in referring to this music, but also you'll have what's typically referred to today as the modern Enka style, and that's pretty much what you're hearing today in the example I played at the beginning. But let me play you part of a recording from the 1950s. The song is called Last Train with a Red Lamp. You'll hear a larger ensemble of instruments in the background. You'll hear something that's based on pentatonic melodies, but with Western chords or Western harmony in support of it. The text, the song, as I say, is called Last Train with Red Lamp. In the song, what you have is a man standing on a train platform at night. And during the song, the train departs and he watches the train sort of fading out of sight with a red lamp, a red lantern swinging on the back. It's the train that's carrying his lover away from him. Let me play part of this example. Listen for the Japanese language. I've told you what the song's about, but listen for the larger ensemble, the harmony being provided by that ensemble to a largely pentatonic melody being sung by the vocalist. Okay, this is from 1954, an example of from the early period we refer to as modern enka, the earliest modern enka.
白いおにぎの明かりに濡れて別れ切ないプラットホームベルが鳴るベルが鳴るさらばと告げて手を振る君は赤いランプの終列車
All right. As I say, this is pretty much the form in which we hear enka today. Like I say, if you turn on NHK, you've got the larger ensembles, you've got largely pentatonic melodies, and the main pentatonic melody you mostly hear today in enka music is this one. That you'll hear the vocals singing melodies based on that scale, while we have the large ensemble of Western instruments accompanying it with Western style harmony. And of course the sort of sorrowful lyrics about lost love or broken romances or whatever. That's a sort of a mainstay in enka lyrics. One other thing I'll point out here that's very Japanese in modern enka is the vocal style. I'm going to play just a little bit more of that one. If you'll notice, there's a lot of vocal, what I refer to as vocal ornamentation, a lot of little shakes and trills in the voice that we also very often hear in the singing of Japanese minyo or folk songs. Let me play just a moment more of that.
Platform, bellが鳴る、ベルが鳴る、さらばと告げて手を振る君は赤いランプの終列車。
All right. That sort of, as I say, brings us up to the modern form of enka. To me, it was always interesting. The history of enka was interesting to me to see how it started as one thing and evolved over a period of many years, gradually absorbing Western influences, but also retaining certain elements of traditional Japanese music, so that when I hear enka today, it seems to be sort of a half and half fusion of the two. Now, I will say this modern enka was popular in the late 50s. It was popular into the 60s. By the mid 60s and late 60s, enka began to decline in popularity. And as I point out in my world music class, in many cultures, many traditional musics began to fade or in popularity in the 1960s, largely because young people began to listen to more modern forms that was appealing to them, especially rock and roll. By the 60s, of course, rock and roll was a worldwide phenomenon. Enka, by the late 60s and early 70s, was in danger of extinction, but it did not become extinct. Why not? Largely because of technology. And it's a technology that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and that is karaoke, or as Americans like to say, karaoke. The development of karaoke, when it first appeared in the early 1970s, many of the songs on the karaoke machines were enka songs. And so Japanese young people began to hear these enka songs, and because they were enjoying the karaoke, it sort of caught on with them, and it sort of revived enka with a younger audience. Okay, I'm going to conclude my part of the presentation with one last example here that I found a while back. You remember a few minutes ago I played you Opekepe, that early enka song. Let me go back to that for just a moment. I'll do the recent recording of this old song. Listen to it once again.
権利幸福嫌いな人に自由とおば飲ましたい。おっぺけぺおっぺけぺおっぺけぺっぽぺっぽっぽは硬い紙紐角取れてアマンテルズボンに人力車粋な側発ボンネット貴女に紳士のいでたちで上辺の
All right, apparently an enterprising and imaginative young Japanese musician instantly made a connection of this older form of Japanese music, the early enka, with a more modern type of music, and did his own version of Opekepe by sampling the old recordings.
The microphone, cause when it's on, it's on. You know the rules, fool, you better get lost. Get on my side before I said you won. Punch to the face and I'ma break your jaw. 1, 2, 3, 4.
権利幸福嫌いな人に自由とおば飲ましたい。おっぺけぺおっぺけぺおっぺけぺっぽぺっぽっぽは
Hit him with the punchline, catch him on the blast side.
硬い紙紐角取れてアマンテルズボンに人力車粋な側発ボンネット貴女に紳士のいでたちで上辺の飾りはよけれども政治の思想が欠乏だ天地の真理がわからない心に自由の種をまけおっぺけぺおっぺけぺっぽぺっぽっぽ
Okay, so there you have it. Enka is definitely not dead. It's being kept alive, even by young people in Japan today. All right, that'll conclude my part of this part of the portion of the presentation. I will say that if any of you are interested, there's a lot of enka there on YouTube. All but one of the examples I was playing today were examples that I found on YouTube. But as I say, once again, the history of enka is what really fascinates me, to see the way it evolved over a period of 100-something years. Students in my class know that I also have a keen interest in the connection between popular music and politics or political social movements. So that's one of the things that instantly caught my attention about enka. To hear it today, you would never know where it came from just on that alone, but it has a very interesting history for me. All right, Amani, should I turn it over to you?
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Horton,
Sure.
for your presentation today. And additionally, thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. It's really interesting at the end where you were playing like the most recent version of, not most recent version, but like the combination of like hip hop influences with traditional music, such as, or that traditional song Opekepe. Because when I first heard it, that's kind of what I was thinking. It sounded like hip hop, like kind of rap hip hop. So that's really interesting to see how that's kind of mashed up, together.
Yeah, which I think is why you saw the name of the man who wrote that song 125 years ago, and they were referring to him in the title as the legendary rapper.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Dr. Horton, we have some really interesting questions in our chat today. So one question that I do want to ask, so you mentioned like Western instruments and chordal harmony has over time influenced Inca. Um, so would you say there's like a specific way of singing or tone that's used in Inca that's very distinctive compared to like today's popular music?
Yeah, and it was one of the things I was mentioning there that really appeared in Enka, in modern Enka in the 1950s and 60s. It's different from other Frank Sinatra type singing. It's that very ornamental style, and you can hear it even better in that very first example that I played for you, where the women were singing the song. And by the way, they were singing about lost loves as well, but that what I call an ornamented vocal style with lots of little shakes and things like this. You'll hear this kind of thing in Japanese traditional instrumental playing as well, but it's very characteristic of the singing style of modern Enka.
I see. So you also mentioned that the early version of Inca is like influenced by political speech, or it was mostly composed of music that was political speech. Has there been any songs in recent years that might have been written kind of in this way, to your knowledge?
You mean as an imitation of early Enka? None comes to mind immediately. That's not to say that it's not there. It may very well be, but I'm not familiar. The closest I know is what I just played a moment ago of this updated sort of reworked version of the older song. It's possible. But of course, Enka started as a type of political speech, which was musical as a way to get around the restriction on actually speaking about democracy. So in a way, it was a thing of its time, I think. Although, once again, it's not to say that it doesn't exist at all.
I think that would be very interesting to be used as like a medium for kind of sharing opinions today, because we have like social media and we have YouTube and things like that. So it's really interesting if that was something that younger people would use to.
Well, wait. Let me add a little addendum to what I said. In a way, hip hop is that. I mean, I'm not extensively familiar with Japanese hip hop in terms of text, lyrics, just the sound. But I know when hip hop began in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, it was not, these were not just fun songs, about how fun life is. They were expressions that were mainly expressing the circumstances of African Americans in music. It was kind of like the 20th century version of the 19th century blues that emerged in America. So in that sense, hip hop started off, or it has a political or social aspect to it. And I'm sure the same thing is true in Japanese hip hop, which might be why the person who did that recording made that connection.
I see. So question by Jeff. He asks, was Enka popular amongst mainly average Japanese people, or was it popular with the elites? I cannot imagine the elitists happily listening to heavily political Enka. What were the elites listening to during this time?
And that's why it changed. Obviously, it changed with the times. It changed due to pressures, as we saw by the 1920s. Remember, one of the things I didn't talk about, which was another Western influence that happened during the Meiji era, the Emperor Meiji looked at Western countries, especially in Europe, and said, hey, they've got big militaries. I want one of those too. And of course, that led to increased militarism in Japan. And in the early 1900s, we had this very strong central government, not a lot of power in the hands of the people. Military increasingly got more and more power. Songs like Nonkibushi, Carefree, the one that I showed you, had some political lyrics. but that were excluded from the original 1918 recording would not have been popular among people. It would have been sort of taboo. It would only have been popular among the more radical thinkers of the time, whereas sort of the mainstream people would have been listening to the more traditional type folk songs or safe popular songs of the era.
So to kind of go along with this, is there a traditional dance that goes along with traditional Inca music? Because he also said that he imagines some kind of, traditional dancing kind of happening while this music is playing.
I won't say there is. I mean, sometimes you will see Inca singers, doing some movements, but I don't think there's, as far as I know, there's no traditional dance that goes along with it. And of course, it was completely not intended as any kind of dance music in its early years. So it would, if there was any dancing that was done to it, that would have been something that would have been added to it sort of marginally along the way, but I'm not aware of any dances.
So Vivian Ying asks, what distinguishes early Inca from like Minyo?
Minyo. Yeah, well, you said early Inca. What largely distinguishes it from early Minyo, number one, is the text, what they're about. That more than anything, that's the whole reason that Inca came into being to begin with. As I say, was a way around restrictions on making political speeches. I can't speak about politics, so I'll sing about it. They don't say I can't sing about it. It was that sort of thing. Minyo folk songs, they're more about your furusato, your hometown, or something like that. The early Inca also, as far as I can tell, in any of the recordings I've heard, don't use the ornamental vocal style, although Minyo often does and did. One thing they do have in common is in the early days is the instrumental accompaniment. It's very often, for example, shamisen. So they do have similarities, but they also have some very distinctive differences.
So as it relates to Korean trot music, William Downey asks, what are your thoughts on Korean trot music in relation to Enka?
I've heard Korean trot music. I've read a little bit about it, but I don't know enough about it, I have to say, to make any kind of real connection to Enka. I suppose it's just, like in any culture, you've got different types of music that come along that are a product of their times. But as far as making a real musical or social or political connection, I can't do that.
Kevin Fenton asks, is the drum set used much in Inca music? Also, are taiko drums used in Inca music or not really?
If they are, it's very infrequent. It's more stringed and wind instruments. In the first example I showed you, you were seeing a totally Western orchestra. You saw violins, you saw some horns, you might see a keyboard. Occasionally, you might see some of the traditional instruments like shamisen being used as an accompaniment to Enka, but drums are not a very prominent part of Enka music. It's more a melody than a rhythm-based music, which is kind of interesting. This sort of brings up an interesting point, because if you think about it, like hip hop is a type of music that is almost totally based on rhythm, at least, the earliest rap and hip hop. And if you look at the earliest Enka, that's more about rhythm as well as the rhythm of the speech that's being delivered, with a de-emphasis on the music, with the music there sort of just to sort of keep it from being completely a spoken word. But no, I don't hear the use of drums very extensively, if hardly at all, in Enka music.
So in addition to this question with instruments, kind of going back to what we were talking about with regards to vocal trills, quite a few audience members had a bit of a discussion in the chat about vocal trills or shakes, and they compared it to the Chinese work Xian Shan. Excuse me, it's really difficult to pronounce. But the song is called Yellow Fever Cantata, among others. Could you talk a bit more about like these vocal flourishes?
I'm well, I'm not sure what you want me to say, but first of all, they're not always easy to do. I mean, actually, enka singers are quite skilled because it takes a lot of control of the voice to be able to do this. Just like there are professional folk song singers in Japan. One of the things that's sort of a little bit of a contradiction is that folk music or minyo typically is supposed to be music of everyone, for everyone, of the common people. But as I say, there are professional folk singers that are very skillful at controlling, their vocal cords. Some can do these very complex trills, not just like that, but between notes that are fairly distant from each other. But with enka singing and with professional minyo or folk song singers, these vocal skills are very, very valued. That's part of what makes the good singers, the really popular ones are.
So we're talking about enka singing or the skill as vocal trills. Is there actually a specific term for that? This is a question by
kobushi. I think the term is kobushi. Yeah, which is a reference to the ornamental style of singing.
I see. And so just to re-emphasize or to kind of go repeat what you said. So this is related to minyo, these kinds of kobushi.
I hear it a lot in the singing of minyo especially by professional minyo singers. Yeah. And to me, that's one of the things that carried over. As I say, and when you listen to modern enka, it's really almost a perfect blend of Western and Japanese traditional elements, and that's what makes it musically very interesting to me is that sort of interesting blend. But one of those is the vocal style. That's very Japanese. The use of the pentatonic scale is very Japanese. Of course, the instruments are more Western. The use of Western harmonies is Western. Oh, I'm not hearing you, Amani.
Sorry. So the next question is by Stephen Fredowitz. He says, enka is often compared to American country music as the lyrics often deal with personal problems, love loss, etc. It's more popular with older people as young people don't have that much life experience. Also, enka is often associated with drinking and izakaya. Can you comment on these ideas?
Yeah, I completely understand that. In America, and you specifically mentioned country Western music. To be even more specific, if enka were transplanted to America, it would become honky tonk music. Which often these were country Western songs. They're about your lover's left you, you're crying in your beer, that kind of thing. The same sort of thing appears so often in enka music, references to lost love, having been dumped by someone, you instead of crying in your beer, you're crying in your sake. But yeah, I completely understand that analogy.
Eric Warner asks, so you see modern enka as a way to protect and preserve, do you see modern enka as a way to protect and preserve Japanese culture? I see this in the music of Yoshi Ikuzo and the Tsugaru dialect.
Well, yeah, sure. Just like the music of any culture, I think is a way of preserving part of that culture. Although at the same time, and I emphasize this, for the past half hour, it's preserving certain elements of Japanese music while at the same time absorbing influences from elsewhere. Most notably from the West, obviously. But that's something we observe in all cultures. You'll have traditional music's preserved sometimes in a more pure form by purists, but also you'll see those same musical traditions being combined and fused with elements from other cultures. And by the way, this is one of the things that I talk a lot about in my world music class. I do several different sections, including a section on Japan in that class. And I start usually by talking about traditional music, but then contemporary music, and showing how it tends to be a fusion of traditional elements with elements from elsewhere, including from other cultures.
Thank you so much. So I'm really curious, with regards to your world music class, how would you say, as you mentioned, like in your presentation, younger Japanese people are kind of now rediscovering Enka as, through technology. How would you say what would you say the response is of your students who are learning about Enka for the first time? Maybe, this is their first time coming to Japan, and and maybe they don't watch NHK, but how would you say their response in understanding the history and now having an appreciation for Enka?
I don't know how much they appreciate it, but I think they really are somewhat fascinated with the history, more than if they just hear modern Enka and that's all they know about it. It's the history of it, and as I say, seeing the evolution of it that really makes it interesting. You were referring to students from outside of Japan, but I find, in a way, sometimes the most interested students are those who are Japanese. And I'll make this comment. I started teaching the world music class, about 15 or 20 years ago. And when I first started teaching it at TUJ, at Temple University, the student body was not as diverse as it is at Temple today. The majority were Japanese students. And I wanted to do a section on Japan. At the same time, I felt very self-conscious about going into a classroom of mostly Japanese students and teaching them about Japanese music. I thought, they should be teaching me about Japanese music. But one thing I learned very quickly is that many, and I'm tempted to say most Japanese students don't know nearly as much about the music of their own culture as I thought they would. And many comments that I get from Japanese students at the end of the course, this happens very frequently, is that they were so happy to be able to have a section on Japan where they could learn more about their own culture. And it's not just about Enka, but about all types of Japanese music that I cover. By the way, that's the longest section I do in my world music class now, because I figure it's a good way to introduce non-Japanese to their guest or host culture. And for Japanese students, it's a chance for them to learn more about their own culture. But response to not just Enka, but all aspects of Japanese music is often very, very positive from students in that class.
Thank you. So also, John Mensing asks or says, I was surprised to find a YouTube example of Sanyorai's Kanbun and Kanshi being sung in Enka style. Any thoughts on the linkages between early Enka and Kanshi and Kanbun?
I don't know what kind of comments I can make. It's not surprising to me at all, to find things on YouTube like that now. Actually, there's an abundance of examples of all kinds of, not just Japanese, but all kinds of traditional musics. And I find, just from experience, that I will look up some kind of music and not be able to find it. A year later, suddenly there's a ton of it on there. I can't speak to linkages between the two that you're referring to, but I'm not surprised. I can't say I'm not surprised at all to find that there are examples of what you're referring to on YouTube.
And Jason Gerber asked, how did Enka develop into referencing specific places? For example, most of Mizumori's Kaori songs.
Yeah, that's always been a characteristic of minyo, of folk songs, Many folk songs are songs that are associated with a specific region of Japan or even a specific village of Japan. So that's something that's been there all along. So that's not a new kind of thing. My guess is that would be an influence from Minyo. As much as anything, but Minyo folk songs in Japan have for a long time specifically come about because of one's nostalgia for a hometown or for one's love for one's furusato or hometown, whatever. But that's been around a long time in Minyo.
I'm really curious. So like in the United States, there's a lot of cities that are known for like being music capitals, if you will, where certain kinds of music originated from.
Mhm.
Is there specific places in Japan or a specific place in Japan that you think or you know of that enka originated from?
Uh, well, I assume the Tokyo, what we now call the Tokyo area, would be because that's where the central government was located. So that would have been the sort of the ground zero for the beginning of Anka, because that was the center of the freedom and people's rights movement that I was referencing earlier.
I see. And my last question is, so in your opinion, so I realize that Inca is traditional Japanese music, and a lot of times when you watch NHK or you watch singers performing Inca, they're wearing kimono. But do you think that this is more so maybe less about tradition, like the tradition, and more so about creating an experience? Because when I watch it, I feel the experience of like traditional Japanese music and like traditional Japan with the
Yeah, I think it's about both. I think it's about both. And of course, my guess would be that many members of the audience are not even really thinking about things like Western influence in Enka. That interests me, as a musician looking at the music. But of course, if you just listen to it right away, first of all, Enka, it sounds very Japanese. Even though you're seeing Western instruments in the background and you're hearing Western harmonies, there's still something about it that's very Japanese. And part of it has to do with those things that I talked about earlier, the use of the pentatonic scales. As soon as you start playing or singing a melody, like that, it automatically has a Japanese quality to it. And of course, you also mentioned a moment ago the typical attire of the female singers dressed in kimono. That's very, very typical. And of course, the Japanese language. We talked earlier about the ornamented vocal style, which automatically reminds one who is familiar with some traditional Japanese music of minyo singing and folk songs singing. So yeah, I think for many it is a completely Japanese tradition, but it's interesting to me at the same time to be aware of the non-Japanese musical elements in it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horton. So the final question, it's a bit of a double question very quickly. So do you have, or could you give us one or two names to possibly search for Inca, music or singers? And also, do you have any favorite intersections of Western classical music with traditional Japanese music?
Okay. To start with, I mean, if you put in Enka, do a search for Enka history, you'll come up with a number of names, modern. One name, the man who wrote the song, the violin Enka, Nonkibushi or Carefree, is Soeda Azembo. Soeda Azembo. He's one of the earliest Enka song composers. You can start with him. And the second part of the question was intersection between, what was it?
Intersection between Western classical music with traditional Japanese music.
Yeah. The Japanese composer Toru Takemitsu. Excellent example. He's was a classical contemporary composer working, with Western instruments most of the time, although he also incorporated traditional Japanese instruments into the modern Western orchestra. But at the same time, his music, although it comes out of a tradition that's influenced by Western composers like Stravinsky and Debussy, also his music is very Japanese at the same time, and it brings certain Japanese sensibilities to it in terms of the style, the use of silence, for example, in coordination with Japanese Western instruments and orchestral sounds. Toru Takemitsu, he did a lot of the scores for a lot of the can't remember the name, the director's name. Kurosawa. A lot of the Kurosawa films he did the scores for, but he also wrote a lot of non-film music as well.
Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge that last question about the intersection question was from Andy Van Hewitt.
Okay.
So Dr. Horton, once again, we want to thank you for your presentation today. And we want to thank our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York. And lastly, before we leave, I would like to share some upcoming events. So on Thursday, June 15th at 17:30, there's an in-person event in Sasebo. It is Japan's graying security landscape, and it is an in-person seminar. So this is in Sasebo on June 15th. On Tuesday, June 20th at 18:30, there is an Indo-Pacific Dialogue co-hosted with Temple University, Japan. It is an in-person event at Temple University in room 401. It is also on Japan's graying security landscape. Dr. Andrew Oros will be the speaker for this event. On Wednesday, June 21st at 17:30, there is a community conversations event in Yokosuka. It is on shaping and operationalizing joint strategies and readiness challenges for Japan's defense planning. This is an in-person event in Yokosuka. So if you are in the area, please join us at 17:30 for refreshments. The seminar will start at 18:15, and the speaker will be Dr. Ryo Hinata Yamaguchi. The next Getting to Know Japan webinar series webinar will be on the history of Okinawa and the Ryukyu Kingdom. It will be on Thursday, June 22nd at 1900. Professor Travis Seifman will be the speaker for this event. So for all events in person and online, we ask you to kindly register, or to find out more information, please visit us on the YCAPS website. And once again, thank you everyone for joining us today for this Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you once again, Dr. Horton, for speaking with us today. The talk was very, very interesting, and I know everyone learned a lot. We hope to see you next time, and we hope you have an enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you.